Okay, I'm going to put my faith in the technology and hope everyone can see and hear me okay. Hello and welcome to the first in a new series of live webinars from tes.com. Over the coming weeks, I'll be speaking to some of our contributors and columnists about some of the big issues in education. Oh, I'm getting some feedback. Yes, we'll be talking to some of our contributors. Coming up next week, we've got Carol Henderson from Grief Recovery, who will be talking about what we mean by grief, how to identify it, how to support those going through it. Later in the week, we'll have Jenny Devine, who's a head out in Northern Italy, who's obviously been extremely affected by the situation. She's going to be talking about what's coming up for 12 weeks in lockdown, I think, for her, and her plans on going back to school. If you want the rest of the schedule, you can go over to tes.com/Vodagogy. And if you want to ask any of those guests or our guest today, any questions, you can use the hashtag #TesVodagogy on Twitter. So yes, today I'm joined by Tamsin Ford. Tamsin is a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Cambridge. One of the biggest names in UK child mental health research. She did a huge study 2 years ago with NHS Digital, looking at the mental health of young people, sort of unprecedented in size. And Tamsin, hello, thank you for joining me.
Hello, nice to meet you, as it were, and hello to everyone who's watching.
So that study 2 years ago, what 2 years on in the current situation we've got ourselves in now, what do you think the sort of mental health for young people will be like right now, given the circumstances?
Well, I think it's a really, really important question, because the whole of our population, in fact, most of the world, has very suddenly been exposed to absolutely massive changes in their social conditions, and in particular the sudden loss of routine, the sudden loss of social contact is likely to impact mental health. However, I think we don't have good data yet. So the Office for National Statistics and NatSen, the two survey organisations that NHS Digital commissioned to gather the data, we're working together to try and get data on a sample that we knew before baseline. So there are numerous surveys, I'm sure people have seen them, asking people about their experience during COVID, and they will give us useful little snapshots of what's going on now. But the trouble is, we don't know how many people saw the survey and didn't click and give information, and it's likely that those who are more worried, and also those who have access to social media and more time on their hands, are likely to fill them in. So having data on a well-characterized sample and knowing where people were beforehand will help us understand which groups are the most vulnerable. We can have some theoretical ideas, and it may be that for some young people, actually, life at the moment might be quite a lot better. And for some of them, I foresee real problems when schools reopen and life gets back to normal. And I think it's really important we get data on that, and we're working very hard behind the scenes. But the short answer is to say we suspect there will be a peak in anxiety, particularly related to health anxiety. We know that some parts of the population will be having a much more stressful time than others, those particularly who are in families where the finances are hard hit, or they've been exposed to bereavement and lost relatives, or perhaps even been very ill themselves. And in terms of education, the children with special educational needs are another very vulnerable group, as are those with pre-existing health conditions, be they mental health or physical health. I can't hear you.
That's a very interesting point about it's anxiety around returning to school. I think that we've got a question that's come in. We can ask that later. So what is it in particular that you think that might cause the most concern? You mentioned sort of health anxiety, but is it the disease? Is it this sustained period of lockdown that we're in? Is it the lack of perhaps school as a bit of a support network? What do you think's the biggest risk here?
I think there are lots of different risks, and all of the ones you've mentioned are very important, and that they will have a different level of importance for different age groups and different types of individuals. So everybody gets a bit anxious and a little bit sad at times. It's part of normal human experience, and those emotions are there because they are evolutionary important. If you are anxious and fearful of things, you avoid them, and that can keep you safe. If you are sad, it's an indication that something is not right in the situation you're in, and you need to do something to change it. It becomes a problem when it impacts on your ability to function. And as with most things, there are some children and some adults that are very anxious and impaired by their anxiety. It stops them actually being able to carry on with everyday life as well as they might. And there are some who probably are too unfearful and therefore at risk because they don't get anxious about things when perhaps they really ought to. Now, the people who are more anxious on the whole might tend to be more anxious about the news of COVID, might be more anxious about catching the disease. So we expect to see a spike in people with anxieties around germs, with anxieties around social contact, with anxieties about contracting COVID, who might actually find it harder when they have to go out of their houses. On the other hand, there are children with neurodevelopmental conditions like autism spectrum or ADHD, where for slightly differing reasons, actually lockdown is going to be very difficult for them. So children with autism spectrum conditions really struggle with change. And even predictable changes like the clocks going back or holidays, half terms can be really, really tough for families to manage. And then when the world suddenly changes to the amount that it has for these children now, there will be some families that are really struggling, which is why the government relaxed the recommendation that you could only go out once a day for people like that who just, they really can't deal with it and they need to stick to the routines where they can. Well, again, those young people are going to find it different when the world changes the other way, when we start going back. And there are ways to help people manage that, but we need to be sensitive to that. And likewise for children with ADHD who are more than usually active, depending on the size of house and the availability of safe green space that the families can access, it's very difficult if you have one or more very active children who are very young and you don't have access to a park and maybe you're in a small flat. Compared to a family where, maybe the child's got their own space, there are a number of rooms that they can be in, and perhaps there's a garden to go and kick a ball in safely and, burn off some of that energy. So there are different risks. And I think the other group to really think about are teenagers, because peer relationships are a huge part of how you develop as a teenager. And, we're very lucky to be living through a pandemic in this day and age where actually social media does allow you, provided you have access to reasonable Wi-Fi, does allow you to keep in touch with your friends, but it's not the same as the sort of hurly-burly of every day going to school and the outside school activities that young people might be going into. And there is often a peak of social anxiety around the mid-teens, and I guess we need to study what happens as a result of the fact that teenagers have had their relationships with each other kind of disrupted in this way.
Yeah, we'll come back to the sort of social media screen time point later, if that's all right. But just on those sort of at-risk groups, for teachers and school staff, what what can they do if they're aware that there might be someone in their class that's particularly at risk? Is there anything they can do to kind of alleviate some of that anxiety?
Well, I think simple advice for everybody, for all of us, about how to maintain health during this is look after the basics. So try and keep a reasonable routine. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as the school day, but try and get up at a reasonably similar time each day, because that will help you sleep, and sleep is integral to mood and also can affect anxiety and irritability. Eating, the tendency, particularly for teenagers, and I've seen it with my own children, is to sleep in late, and then perhaps you miss out on breakfast, or you have breakfast very late, and then you don't, you can easily start missing a meal a day if you're not careful. And again, how you feel in your mood is very determined by being adequately fed. Having sufficient exercise, which can be a bit tricky, but you can do yoga, you can do all kinds of exercise within your own house. Maybe going out for a brisk walk, it's still getting some exercise. So trying to keep reasonably fit, and then connecting with people where you can. So encouraging people to look after themselves. I think also just checking in with the youngsters and colleagues that teachers are a bit worried about. Just kind of checking in and saying, how are you? You're not going to make people feel worse by asking. And you don't have to make it a loaded question, but just giving people space and, an offer to chat if they want to, perhaps people they could talk to within the school staff, if that might be helpful. But actually, it's about looking after yourself, self-care, the very basics, connecting with people, exercising, eating and sleeping, and sort of scheduling some activities to do, some of which may be a bit, less exciting than others, but some of them should be about fun, and doing things that you enjoy, because that is good for your mood.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's that degree of separation that technology brings in. Perhaps the person you might say, "Oh, how are you?" in the corridor to, you wouldn't potentially message. So it's a difficult one to judge. But yeah, that's good advice. So do you think there's probably a low level of anxiety amongst a huge percentage of the population at the moment? Do you think there's a danger of perhaps overdiagnosis, or people maybe things get missed because there is this kind of underlying level of anxiety? Is that going to be a problem, do you think?
Well, I think young people will look to the adults to see how they cope. So we have a role to model behaviour and management for them. So they will look to their parents, but also we shouldn't forget what important impacts teachers and other staff working in schools have on young people. We are role models for them. And I think it is right to be a bit worried about such a threat to the population, but it's being managed. And I think what we should be modeling for young people is that, yes, there are serious risks, but there are things that we can do to keep each other safe. So I do worry a bit about all the surveys that are focusing on mental health and distress, because I think, as you say, we've all had to adjust to absolutely massive changes in our working and home environments. The fact that it's universal actually might make it easier to cope with. We're all in the same boat, but actually we're all having to adjust. And, some of us react better to change than others. Some of us are dealing with more adversity than others, but we're all having to adjust. And, as humans, we like things to stay the same. They never do, but we like them to. I think the important thing, if you're trying to make up your mind about whether your own, your child's, or one of your pupils' difficulties is slipping into the realm of a real problem, it's whether or not you can keep functioning. So if the level of anxiety or sadness or any other sort of behavioral problem is actually getting in the way of the young person being able to do what they need to do at this moment in time, then I think it's tipping in to becoming a problem and probably needs dealing with. And if people employ those basic clinical principles of assessment, then I don't think we will overdiagnose. I think it's good to encourage people to seek help if they need to, but I think a certain degree of, this is a very, very unusual time in history that we're all living through, a certain kind of normalization of this is different and we've all had to deal with changes. I don't think we should be trying to debrief people. The traumatic events literature suggests that, proactive debriefing very close to traumatic events actually can exacerbate problems. So I think we need to be careful not to assume that everyone's going to have massive difficulties, but there will be some that do, and we need to be alert to those who are struggling to function in their everyday life.
So I guess some teachers will be now teaching remotely, perhaps not having the same interactions with their staff, with their students that they're used to. What sort of signs could they look out for in this sort of online environment in terms of behaviour that might be a bit different from a classroom environment?
Well, I guess I think we all need to be gentle with ourselves, and that includes the teachers, who are, I can't imagine what it's like trying to teach a class of sort of 20 plus students when nobody's in the room. I've done it with medical students, but they're in their 20s and they're kind of there because they want to be. That might not be the same with some teenagers doing physics or history or geography. So, huge respect to teachers who are grappling with how to do this. I would keep an eye out for who's not there. And I wouldn't necessarily be punitive about that. I would be concerned. Who's not joining in and why might that be? And then for those who are in the virtual classroom, it's looking for the young person who doesn't seem to be really quite there, even if they're physically logged on. Are they listening and responding as you would expect them to? By this point in the year, the longest term is the autumn term, isn't it? So at least teachers and teaching assistants have had a chance to get to know young people by this point in the year. And I'd just be alert to differences. I'd be alert to the person who is withdrawn, whether they're logged on or not. And then you might find some young people are more effectively volatile, more irritable, if they're anxious or if they're a bit sad. And again, I think we just need to give each other some leeway. I'm aware I've been a bit more grumpy about some things whilst all this is going on, with sort of frustration of things that I can't do that I want to do. So I think the signs will be similar to normal, and teachers should just trust their judgment. So I have a paper coming out led by a master's student called Frankie Matthews, which will be published shortly in Child and Adolescent Mental Health, which is a journal for anybody interested in mental health, produced by the Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health. And using national survey data, we looked at how teacher concern predicted serious mental health conditions. And when teachers aren't worried, it's almost 100% predictive. Teachers are very, very good at thinking that young person's fine. And when teachers are worried, the young people are doing worse, are doing significantly worse than the young people that the teachers aren't worried about. So you guys pick up when young people aren't doing so well. It's not necessarily predictive of what a child psychiatrist like me would call a mental health condition. So, I don't think you're likely to miss problems. I think as teachers, you're very alert to where your pupils are, and you will pick up kids who are worried. And then it's the judgment call about, well, how much is this getting in the way of what they're trying to do? How much of this is an adjustment that I'm seeing? And I think then it's keeping an eye on things over time. You know, if it persists over several weeks and it's getting in the way of the child being able to function at home and at school, then perhaps it's time to, you know, have a chat with the young person, and maybe also the parents. Are they worried too? And if both parents and teachers are worried, that's even more predictive of a quite serious problem.
Okay. We've had one question come in here from YouTube. Martin Speed and some other teachers, I think, are asking, is it enough to just signpost children to places they can get help, or do you think schools need to train staff specifically in mental health, or should there be a sort of designated member of staff who looks out for things like this?
That's a really interesting and important question. I think teaching is a very demanding profession in its own right. I think teachers work incredibly hard, and I worry that because teachers are kind of the final common pathway towards young people and children, that quite often we think, oh, teachers are well placed to do that, and teachers are well placed, you know, and I do wonder about the time you all have. So I think whilst it would be really good for teachers to have a kind of grounding in the types of mental health conditions that are common in different age groups, because it does vary, and need to be able to skill themselves up in a particular problem that may pop up in their career. Like, you know, you may suddenly have a child who has an eating disorder in your tutor group or something, and it would be good to be quickly able to kind of read up about it with reliable information, etc. You know, that's the kind of level of training that I think teachers need. I think the government green paper was recommending a designated mental health lead in each school. And I think we have a designated lead for children who are looked after. We have a designated lead for special educational needs and disability. I think that kind of a role is a good one, but we need to think carefully about training, about support and supervision going forward, and also realize that, you know, teachers aren't therapists. They might want to train as therapists as an alternative career or something they do outside, but actually teachers' role in schools is teaching, and that it's really important that we broaden the access to mental health services. I think not everybody needs to see a psychiatrist. Not everybody who's got a mental health problem needs to see a psychiatrist. There's a lot that families and schools and those around the child can do, just being pointed at really useful, good sources of information. There's a lot you can do by subtly changing the environment around the child. I think, you know, by the time you've become a teenager, there's a lot that young people can do to help themselves if given the right advice and pointed in the right direction, which is kind of signposting. And then we need, you know, gradually increasing intensity of support. But I don't think it's schools' business to do anything other than the lower level of that, because frankly, you have a much more important day job to do.
Very true. Yes, good. Just on that, I think a lot of people might assume that, you know, mental health conditions kind of become more apparent or develop in teenage years, perhaps, or certainly in secondary school. But there's an important stage prior to that, isn't there? And what could those perhaps primary staff do to identify issues in sort of key stage 1 and key stage 2 children?
Well, that's a very good question. So the types of problems, mental health conditions that children have changes across the lifespan. And you're right, they do get more common as we go into the teenage years. And in fact, there are signals from both the Adult Mental Health Survey, also funded by the government, like the Child Survey published in 2018. There are signals that young women, sort of older teenagers from 16 plus, are a particularly high risk group for anxiety, depression and self-harm. You know, a really really quite worried. And where there have been repeated surveys, that's a sudden change. But we shouldn't forget that about 1 in 10 of primary school children will have an impairing mental health condition. So that's 2 to 3 in each classroom, if you think an average class about 25 to 30. The types of conditions are different. So in the mid-teenage years, you get the peak onset of anxiety and depression. You get slightly different kinds of anxiety. So amongst younger children, you're more likely to get what's called separation anxiety, where the child really struggles to get to school, to go to outside school events, to leave the family home in a disabling way. A degree of that is normal, but when it actually, you know, nobody would think there was anything unusual about a 3-year-old who struggled to spend the night away from mum and dad. But if you're 19 and you still can't spend a night away from home, that's clearly a problem. And obviously in the middle, there is a kind of grey patch. Younger children are more likely to have neurodevelopmental disorders. So autism, ADHD, and also behaviour problems are evident in preschool children, and they are the most common type of problem amongst primary school children. I think what primary school teachers will probably notice is a bit of regression, so that behaviour may be sort of less socially and developmentally appropriate than you would expect from the children you've got to know earlier in the year. And that's a normal thing that happens whilst children are adjusting to sudden changes in their life. Some of them might be anxious. Depression in primary age children does happen. Nothing in medicine never or always happens, but it's very rare. So I wouldn't be looking out for depression. I'd look out for anxiety, and I'd look out for behaviour change. I would expect a little bit of it, but if it doesn't settle reasonably quickly, then I might start thinking, well, you know, how much is this getting in the way of what the child needs to do?
Okay, great. I'm going to jump back to some of the questions that have come in while we've been talking. One teacher on YouTube asked, how can we make children school ready with potentially a very short lead-in time? I'm going to try and rattle through as many of these as I can in the time we've got left. And that's the first one. Well,
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that a lot of people in policy and practice, both education and mental health, are thinking very hard about. I think there are particular groups that we need to worry quite a lot about. So those whose attendance was patchy or who had anxiety-related difficulty in attendance, they will have had a long time at home, and it's going to be harder for them to come back. So checking in with parents and developing plans with parents to ease them back into school, and being, you know, hugely encouraging of success, even if it's very limited. You know, for some children, even getting to the playground on the first day might be a major achievement. I think warning children with us, you know, again, there wasn't much notice that schools were closing, and we might not get much notice that schools are opening again, but where you can give warnings that you're confident, you know, preparing children. And I think, you know, as educators, you're very experienced in easing children into new school years. I would almost treat it like a new school year, with, you know, allowing a little settling down period and not expecting to go straight back into, you know, the full routine. But this is not based on evidence, because there isn't a lot of evidence. We don't have school closures very often. And I guess, you know, the senior management team needs to fall back on its experience to monitor what's going on and tweak it if needs be. But I think preparation with support for those that you're worried about. And again, you know, schools know their pupils. They will know who are the most vulnerable, and expecting a little bit of kind of, you know, the need to settle down and settle back into it the way you would get at the beginning of a new academic year after a gap.
Is there another good question? Rebecca Batchelor on YouTube has asked what training you'd recommend, and if there's any sort of materials out there for those currently dealing with children's mental health issues due to COVID?
That's a really excellent question. There is an awful lot of online resources, not all of them as evidence-based as there might be. The ones I would recommend are Minded, where you can either register and do it as continuing professional development, or you can just think, well, I want to know about depression, so I will go into the depression section. And those are written by experts. They were funded initially by the Royal College of Paediatrics and then later the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and they are really high quality materials, and they're a range of different streams depending on how much people think they know. So I really recommend that. The Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health has a really good website with podcasts and research digests, and it's aimed at anybody who's interested in the mental health of children, and its mission is about getting evidence into practice. So, you know, the quality of the materials that come off that website are very good. The Anna Freud Centre has produced some excellent materials with the Healthy Schools Foundation as well, which is part of Heads Together. So again, these are high quality materials. And finally, the Royal College of Psychiatrists has got a section on its website for publications, for information for anybody, and there's a whole bit devoted to young people, with information for young people and carers. So those are really good sites where you can get sound information at your fingertips if you want.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll collate those links afterwards and make sure they're in the description for this video. Just another comment here that's come in, Barry Sullivan. Should we be doing things differently for children who are in care?
Again, a really excellent question. The children who are in care are an extremely vulnerable group. So at the time when the prevalence of significant mental health conditions in the general population was 1 in 10, it was almost 1 in 2 amongst the children who were looked after in Great Britain at that time. So they are more likely to have a pre-existing mental health condition. They're more likely to have experienced adversity and to have poor physical health and special educational needs. You get this stacking of risk factors. I think it will depend very much on their current situation. So I used to work in a service that was aimed for children who were looked after. And there's a vast difference between the young person who's in a stable foster care situation with a good relationship with their foster carers, who may have experienced the most appalling adversity in the past, may have had quite severe mental health problems, but providing they're still in that placement, they may well be doing fine. The ones I would most worry about are the ones who are in unstable placements. And if you are in an unstable placement, having to stay home and not being able to, you know, get away from your carers, or the carers not being able to have a break from you, may well put the end to some placements. And those in children's home where the level of support is necessarily harder to provide, because there are lots of young people, all of them with a plethora of difficulties. So those are the more vulnerable groups. But again, I don't think it's inevitable that even these very vulnerable children will necessarily be having a really bad time now.
Okay. So we've got one more question here. Whilst at home, children have been able to have much more sort of control over their learning environment. Would children struggle to adjust to coming back to a sort of classroom where they can't get up and leave? And is there anything that teachers can help aid that transition?
That's a really good question. So I think human beings, but particularly children, are amazingly adjustable. And I think it comes back to the skills that you all have as educators, which I deeply respect, in terms of easing children into new situations. I think what the things that would help, particularly the littler children, primary school children I'm thinking of, is just revising the expectations. Don't think they'll necessarily remember. So sort of sitting down with them and creating the ground rules of what you're wanting. And they will eventually come up with everything you're expecting to hear, but they then kind of own it. And being, adult attention, particularly teachers' attention, is hugely rewarding for children. So use that really important tool wisely. Use it to encourage and support the children who are doing what you want them to, rather than jumping on the sort of minor misbehavior, like getting up and wandering around. You know, if you know you have a child who has struggles to sit for 20 minutes, give them an excuse to get up at 15 and say, you sat really well for 15 minutes. You know, did you realize that's fantastic? Because then they've experienced success and they're encouraged and they'll try even harder. So rather than, you know, Johnny, you're fidgeting, how about, Jonathan, you're sitting really nicely, you know, demonstrate to the class the person who's doing what you want them to do, and tell them what you want them to do rather than what you don't want them to do. And, you know, these simple behavioral techniques, which we've demonstrated empirically for, you know, 150 years, pretty much, are highly, highly effective. So, you know, I think you might find that you have to do a bit more of that, and that they're more unsettled than they were at the beginning of the academic year. But just re-establishing those boundaries and those expectations, I think, will really help.
Mm. There's an interesting question that's come in here from Sarah Dunn, actually. I think we've focused a lot on those year groups who perhaps won't be taking the exams in the normal way, but what are your thoughts on supporting the year sixes moving up into year 7? Obviously, that's a time of a lot of upheaval under any circumstances at the moment, though it's going to be particularly stressful.
Well, they are another vulnerable group, which actually we haven't mentioned today. And I think as are the other young people who'll be facing big transitions. So, you know, those who might be going from school to college because there isn't a sixth form, or those indeed who would have taken their A-levels and gone on to higher education. I think the group to really focus on are the year sixes, because that is a big transition, and that every year there are some children who just really struggle to make it. And I think there's lots of excellent examples of how to help children with that, some of which we can't do at the moment. But maybe, you know, what could you do that you normally do face-to-face remotely? So maybe you can't have them into the secondary school for a tour, but maybe what you can do is a virtual tour. And, you know, maybe the teachers can't go to the primary schools from the secondary schools the way they've done, but maybe they could check in with as many of their tutor groups before they come. So you establish some of those relationships. It's about sort of helping people over the divide. And, you know, I think schools have lots of really excellent ways of building relationships between children, and also between children and their new teachers, that we just need to think a bit differently about what we can do rather than what we can't do, to help young people over that divide as far as we can. And I would say the same for those going on to college. And in fact, there may be things that are easier to do because we can't do them face to face. For example, it would be difficult for a tutor group to get everybody in their tutor group together if they're at different schools, but actually remotely, you might just be able to do it if it's arranged in time, and that would be quite nice. They'd all have a familiar face. And, you know, maybe you might want to be encouraging them to be in contact over the summer so that, you know, some of them hopefully will get on with each other, and it means that they're moving up as a cohort. And I guess the other thing that may help everybody is everybody's in the same boat. It's not like this has happened to any one part of the year 6 across the country. So they're all grappling with this. I think where it's really difficult is when it's one or two individuals who've had a very different experience, and it can be harder to integrate them. They're all in the same boat.
Another question from Twitter here, more about staff. What could leaders do to assist with school staff mental health as they return to school? Like you said, I'm sure for some teachers it would have, and school staff, it would have been a nice break being able to sort of work remotely and not have to deal with a commute. What would leaders put in place, do you think, to help that transition?
Well, I think a lot of the things we've talked about with young people apply. So, you know, checking in with people, if there is anybody who perhaps might be additionally stressed, maybe they've, you know, been bereaved, or maybe they have a frail and elderly relative that they're worried about who lives at home and they're worried about transmitting. In fact, you know, just being sensitive to the things that people are, you know, staff are grappling with outside coming back to school. But you know, planning as far as possible, providing information as far as possible so that people are clear about what they need to do. I think it's unlikely we'll all go back in one fell swoop. So thinking with staff about what are the best ways to handle social distancing, to keep children and staff safe, and having some forums for discussion where staff can raise their anxieties and make suggestions. And then I think, you know, the usual kind of routes for staff to go if they are actively struggling with their mental health.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. Let's finish with so Claire Costello-Kelly has got concerns due to there being restrictions on staff and pupil one-to-one interactions. She's worried that some students might not, you know, voice concerns or talk about private issues in front of their peers. So what things do you think staff could do to help with those students who are struggling?
Well, that's a very good point. And, you know, although there has been a significant and welcome reduction in stigma around mental health, adolescents in particular are excruciatingly sensitive to what their peers think of them. And it's quite difficult to say, I'm struggling with this, if you feel like everybody else is coping perfectly. And of course, you know, I think you achieve adulthood when you realize that actually all of us are blundering around feeling uncertain and insecure most of the time. And perhaps sort of having that discussion as a group, but making sure that students know what the private channels of conversation are, be they within the school or outside the school. So there are a number of helplines that young people can access, and there are direct sources of help. There is their own GP, and there are various across the country counselling sites. So for example, I advise, along with other academics, Place to Be, who are a charity that provide mental health counselling, which is integral to certain schools. And, you know, some schools have their own counsellors who are presumably thinking about how they can offer ongoing support. And then there are voluntary agencies in many areas that offer counselling that's outside of school. So I think it's being aware of the local sources of help and making sure that they are available and that you remind people that they're there.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay. Tamsin, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. That was fantastic, really insightful. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. What we'll do is we'll look at collating some of those unanswered ones and addressing them through the website. Please join me next week. I've got Carol Henderson talking about what we mean by grief, how to identify those who are struggling with it. And then Jenny Devine on Thursday talking about her very long period of lockdown and how she plans to transition out of it. But yeah, thank you all for joining. Cheers. See you next time. Thanks, Tamsin.
Bye.